Social Studies, Chapter 13, Preparing for War. May 10th, 1775. Once again, the leading men from every American colony gathered in Philadelphia for a Continental Congress. This time was different. This time, there had been fighting. This time, men had died. Most of the delegates to the Second Continental Congress weren't sure what to do next. They hated the thought of separating from Great Britain and their king. Couldn't the Continental Congress try again to solve their issues with the mother country? At the same time, they could not ignore the fact that fighting had started. Shouldn't they prepare for more fighting, just in case? The Second Continental Congress did both. Delegates wrote a petition to King George III. A petition is like a request. They told the king that they were still loyal to him. There was no talk of independence. They said they didn't want to break up the British Empire. They only asked that the king to make his government change its bad policy and restore the colonists' rights. The colonists' petition is delivered to King George III. At the same time, the Congress prepared for more fighting. John Adams of Massachusetts took the lead. Adams believed that the local militias were fine for fighting here and there. To fight a war, though, they needed to create a real American army, an army of the United Colonies. At the time, members of the Massachusetts militia were camped outside of Boston, near the British troops. Those militiamen said Adams were ready to be the first soldiers in the new army. But who would lead Adams' Army of the United Colonies? How fortunate that Congress was, Adams continued, to have the right man for the job in that very room. He was a man of great talents and excellent character. He was an experienced military leader from Virginia. As Adams continued to speak, all eyes turned to the tall man dressed in an old militia uniform standing in the back of the room. The man quickly turned and walked out. He wanted the delegates to be free to discuss him without him being present. That man was George Washington. Adams was right, and the other delegates agreed. Washington was the perfect man to lead the Continental Army, as it came to be called. He had gained his military experience in the French and Indian War. After that, he returned to Mount Vernon, Virginia, to run his plantation. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses and a supporter of the Patriot cause. He was also among the best known and wealthiest men in all the colonies. Everyone admired him for his devotion to duty, his cool head, and strong will. It was settled. Washington would command the Continental Army, and its first troops would be the Massachusetts militiamen camped around Boston. They might be needed for action soon. More British soldiers were arriving in the colonies. Washington headed to Massachusetts to take charge of the militia. Before his arrival, though, the American soldiers fought an important battle near Boston. Two hills overlook the city of Boston, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. Every general knows that it's a great advantage to control the high ground. From the top of a hill, you can fire down at the enemy below, especially if you have cannons. Meanwhile, the enemy has to fight its way uphill. The British understood this idea, but they were not very worried about the untrained Massachusetts militiamen. They did not bother to guard the two hills. On the night of June 16, 1775, the militia suddenly marched to Breed's Hill and climbed it. They were supposed to take up positions on Bunker Hill, but moved onto the wrong hill. All night they dug trenches, piling the earth into walls 6 feet high for their protection. When the morning came, the British were surprised to see the colonial militia in control of the hill. General Gage was now worried that the militia would be able to fire on his troops below. They could even use cannons to fire upon the British ships in the harbor. Gage needed to drive the militia off the hill. Gage didn't know that the Massachusetts militia didn't have any cannons. The next day, British soldiers marched up Breed's Hill. The colonists had only a small amount of ammunition. They couldn't afford to waste any. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind their earthen walls. When the British got close, the militiamen opened fire. Hundreds of redcoats fell. The rest fled back down the hill. Once more, the British marched up the hill. Once more, they were driven back by a hail of bullets. After the second charge, the colonists began to run out of ammunition. When the British marched up the hill a third time, the militia retreated. The British won the hill, but at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Just as during their march back from Concord, the British lost about half their men. A British officer said that his army couldn't stand any more victories like this. Even though the battle took place on Breed's Hill, it is known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill was very important to the colonists. They lost the hill, but they won new confidence. They were beginning to believe these citizen soldiers could hold their own against one of the world's greatest armies, the British Army. Soon after, the colonists learned King George III's answer to their petition. He had no intention of backing down. Instead, he was eager to fight.